welcome our next guest to the program. Scott Wheeler of The Athletic joins us. Now, I'll apologize on behalf of Scott because he was in the midst of a move. And unfortunately, the timing got a little screwed up. So that's why he's a big black dot right now on the screen. If you're able to turn your video on, Scott, that's terrific.
Great to see your face, Scott.
I got you guys. You guys get the nice view of my car here with my cardboard boxes here.
That's good.
This could not have been more unprofessional of me here, fellas.
It's all good, Scott.
I had an alarm set for this, and then the alarm went off, and I'm sitting in my car getting rid of cardboard from our move here. So,
Scott, don't worry about it. Marty Baron is constantly doing our show from his car. In fact, oftentimes he's stealing internet just so Wi-Fi so he can do it. So you're in good company right there.
Okay.
We would recommend you not drive while you're answering the questions, but we'll leave that up to you.
Yeah, no, I'm parked in a Shoppers Drug Mart Plaza here.
Oh, there you go. That works. Scott Wheeler from The Athletic is our guest this Saturday morning on the Illegal Curve Hockey Show. Scott does a great ranking every year of all the organization's top prospects, and including the Winnipeg Jets. And we wanted to bring Scott on to talk about his ranking of the Jets prospects. And Scott, you had the Jets ranked number 11 of the 32 NHL teams. Yet you say sort of in your introduction that the Jets were one of the more challenging teams for you to rank among the top 32 of the league. Why was it so difficult for you to find the spot for the Jets among some of the other teams?
I think there are two main things. The first is that they have a pretty considerable top end. I would say that the first 3 or 4 names on their list grade out not as high as the teams in the top 5 or top 6 per se, but in that next tier, they've got a really, really strong. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Cole Perfetti. I actually had Chaz Lucius in my top 10 last year in advance of the draft. So Chaz is a player that I'm really fond of. So the quality there is huge. I mean, even Ville Heinola, I mean, I know you guys are kind of waiting to see him and waiting to see him really grab hold of it and run with a sort of 82 game roster spot here. But I think he's going to be a legitimate second pairing guy. I think those other 2 guys are going to be top 6 forwards. In Cole's case, I think you might end up with a potential star. So I'm really high on those 3, but on the flip side, it's a thin group too. It really does start to thin out. Most of the teams kind of in that 10 to 15 range in my rankings run 20 prospects deep. They run in many cases into the teens in terms of quality, kind of B grade prospects, if you will. And you don't really have that in Winnipeg. It does start to taper off sort of closer to 10 in terms of the number of quality prospects that I think have a legit shot to play NHL games. So it's a thinner group, but then you're balancing that against that high end trio at the top, who are 3 kids that I'm higher on than most scouts, in fact. So that was the tricky part, but I think they ultimately settled kind of in the right range. I had a clear top 9 prospect pools in this year's ranking, and I think they settled right at the front of that sort of second tier in the middle third of the league.
Scott, and I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Ville Heinola there, and I agree with Drew. I mean, we have to give you huge props. You do an amazing job for The Athletic, breaking down prospects, not only, that have already been drafted, but obviously, the 2022 draft class coming up. And, I think, Heinola has been a player that, Jets fans have wanted to see more of, but because of the circumstances with COVID and taxi squads and other just veteran defensemen ahead of him. But I'm not sure if you saw yesterday, he had 5 shots on goal, which is a career high for him. And I have the article here on my app here, and I wanted to read it because you start off the analysis of Heinola. You say he's got a strong foundation of quiet skills that have increasingly begun to get louder and louder. And I thought that was really well written, because he's a guy that obviously, has that offensive upside, and but he also makes just those quietly really good defensive reads. And you go on into the article to talk about that as well. So I imagine you're not at all surprised with how much success he's having with the Jets, especially now that he's getting just more and more confidence.
Yeah, he's always had that sort of escape pressure and make a 5-foot bump pass down pat, right? That's been the bread and butter of his game since he was a kid. And he has increasingly grown more and more ambitious. I think one of the concerns that scouts had with him in advance of his draft year was that he just wasn't quite aggressive enough with the puck. He had the talent to escape pressure and start exits and lead entries and walk the line and make those sort of basic plays that you expect talented defensemen to make in today's NHL. but he wasn't really looking to attack. You didn't see him below the goal line in the offensive zone involving himself in the play all that often. You didn't see him really sort of trying to be 2 layers of pressure instead of 1 layer of pressure. And I think now at the AHL, we've seen that. It will take him some time, I think, in the NHL to get that confidence, to get a leash from the coaching staff that will allow him to play that game. But I do think he's starting to play not a roving style, but a more engaged, a more active style with the puck. And I think that's going to make him a better player long term. If he can find that game in the NHL, suddenly you've got a guy who can't just break the puck out and move the puck and defend well and use his feet and all of that. You've also got a player who's got some real quality offensively to be able to walk off the line and carry the puck deep into the zone and try to take over games rather than just sort of making the right play all the time. So I'm fascinated to see what Ville becomes. I think, again, he's got a chance to be that sort of number 3, number 4 guy who can run your second or potentially even first power play, depending on who else you have in front of him on the depth chart, and really contribute at both ends. And he kind of fits that modern defenseman mold as well. There are a lot of players now who begin to look like Ville Heinola. We're seeing a lot of defensemen come into the league who have that shape that he has. So I'm a big fan of Ville, and he's grown on me over the years. I was high on him in his draft, kind of had him around 20 where he was taken. But even since then, he's impressed me, and I think he's ready to take the next step here.
You know, Scott, one player we had the fortune of talking to after he was drafted was Chaz Lucius. He's got an infectious personality.
Oh my God.
And, you know, and he's one of these kids who, you know, you heard about, you know, what his exploits were in his draft year and how he was, you know, obviously he was dealing with his injury but he had all this talent. He seems to be putting it together a little bit, had a goal and assist last night for the University of Minnesota, but he's not a player that folks get a chance to watch a lot because not a lot of people have that package. So what are you seeing from him? He's got 9 goals, 9 assists so far at Minnesota right now.
Well, first of all, he's just a fabulous kid, and I don't often say that about hockey players. I'm always struck, normally about once or twice a year when I write stories in advance of the draft on the top sort of 15 or 20 kids that interest me. There's always one kid who kind of leaps out. Coincidentally, Cole Perfetti was that kid once upon a time, and then last year Chaz was as well. And both of those kids are so articulate. They're so well-mannered. You don't feel like you're talking to a hockey player when you're talking to either of them. And then on top of that, they're ridiculously talented as well. And I actually think Chaz, because of the knee injury, and it was a weird knee injury, right? It was kind of a cartilage, soft tissue, bone issue more than it was blowing out his ACL. And because of that, there were lots of question marks about his health, how an injury like that heals long-term, and what that looks like for him. And increasingly, as this season has progressed, I think he's put those to bed. He's been sensational, frankly, in the last sort of month and a half, 2 months of the season after a bit of a slow start at Minnesota. And I think you're starting to see that sort of goal-scoring quality that defines him. He's going to be the kind of player who puts the puck in the net and plays on a top power play unit and has that unique sort of game-breaking quality as a shooter. So that's his bread and butter. The skating and the size and getting stronger have always been kind of the question marks, but I actually think he's a much better skater than he often gets credit for, and he's going to be an impact guy. I think if Perfetti is a first-line player, I think Chaz is going to be a very good second-line player, and I think there's a good chance that one of those guys is a 55, 60-point guy, and the other guy is a 70, 75-point guy. And if you can add 2 pieces like that through the draft, that is a tidy bit of work, considering where they were both taken. So I'm really a big fan of both of those kids, not just as people, but certainly as players as well. And I think Chaz was one of the better sort of value selections of last year's draft. And I expect that after 2 years in college, you're going to see him turn pro at the end of his sophomore year, and he's going to have an impact almost immediately, would be my guess.
High praise. Scott Wheeler is our guest Saturday morning. We're live here on the Illegal Curve Hockey Show. Scott covers the NHL and covers draft prospects for The Athletic. Now, Scott, since the Jets returned to Winnipeg, they haven't dipped their toe into Russia too heavily. Yet this past draft, they went there twice for guys that you're high on in both cases. Nikita Chibrikov and Dmitri Rashevsky. Chibrikov, of course, 18 second-round pick. Rashevsky, he's older, 21, has been passed over a couple times in the draft, but he was a 5th-round pick last year. I guess your thoughts on both of those guys since they've been drafted, and is Rashevsky maybe this diamond in the rough, maybe the proverbial late bloomer that the Jets are getting some good value on later in last year's draft?
Yeah, I think Rashevsky, if you were to count on two hands the players from last year's draft who've had the best follow-up seasons relative to where they were picked, Rashevsky's in that group of 10 players from the 212 or whatever it was that were selected. So he's improved his stock. He'd be probably a second-round pick today rather than a fifth-round pick in a redraft if you were to do it all over again. He's been great. He's been an impact guy in the KHL as a rookie, and that really is quite rare. We typically see players in the KHL take a year or two to go from playing sort of 6-7 minutes a night to 12-13 minutes a night, and then eventually 15-16 minutes a night. And he kind of bypassed those first two steps and immediately became a top 9 guy on that team. And not just a top 9 guy, but a guy who was on the second power play and who is scoring goals and making an impact in what is arguably the second best professional league on the planet. So Rashevsky's a great story, already a great story. And I think there's the belief amongst many scouts that I've spoken to about him that despite the fact that he's older, he's kind of early in his trajectory. He's kind of early along his path, which bodes well for what's next for him. So I think you'll see him come over eventually at 22, 23, 24 years old, like a lot of those KHL guys do. Most of those players prefer to stay there and make the immediate jump to the NHL rather than coming over and playing in the AHL. So I think he's probably in that same boat. But if he comes over at that age, I suspect that if he keeps on this path, he'll be a middle six piece. He's not going to be a true impact guy, but I think you could have him as a complementary forward make an impact. And then Chibrikov is really interesting. He's a kid that, again, like Lucius, like Perfetti, like Heinola, I was high on in his draft year and liked that pick where they got him. So he's had a very good season as well. He's on obviously a little bit further behind Rashevsky, but that's predominantly because of his age. And I suspect that he's going to become an impact scorer in the KHL in the next year, maybe 2 years, and then you go from there with him as well. So Chibrikov's a really, really interesting player. My colleague Murat's actually currently working on a story on him at The Athletic, and he's got some quality to his game. So, you're right. Both of those kids are legitimate pieces.
The Jets fans are hoping there's a little Kirill Kaprizov in Nikita Chibrikov, right? Maybe that's going a little bit too far, Scott, but looks like he is going to be a very good prospect. And wanted to ask you about Kristian Vesalainen. We had Kenny Wiebe on earlier, and we talked to Weber about Vesalainen, and he's 22 years old. People, I think, forget that he still is a prospect for the Jets, and he's obviously played a little bit with the Moose, and he was a healthy scratch last night. And you mentioned enigma in your description, and I think it's bang on, because I think we've all expected, not just because he's a first round pick, because of the size and the fact that we've seen that big shot with the Moose in the AHL. Like, is there more to this? Like, is Vesalainen, and again, I think you would agree, we're not going to say the BUST word, not only because it's a 4-letter word and it wouldn't work in Wordle, but just because we don't want to say that for a 22-year-old. But I mean, it just always seems like we're wanting more from Vesalainen.
Yeah, and I think enigma is kind of the perfect way to describe him. It's become a bit frustrating, not just, I'm sure, for the Jets, but for people who have watched him for a long time here. It feels like he's been around forever. He showed so much promise in Sweden and even in Finland early on in his career. And now you're kind of waiting for him to become more than just a guy. And increasingly, I think it looks like it might be hard for him to become more than just a guy. And given how talented he is and what he showed at lower levels, and given that size that you talked about, that has to be a little bit sour. So I try to ignore the where he was drafted piece of the puzzle, because I think we can get carried away with that. But even ignoring that, just as a player, he should be more than he is. So I like to, I've pumped all the tires of these guys, but Vesalainen's a player who I find very difficult and frustrating to watch at this stage in his career, just because you're right. So often I watch him and I'm just left wanting more. And it feels like again and again, he just isn't making plays out there, and he should be with the tools that he has. So I don't know what he is at this point, and the clock is starting to tick, because once you start to get 22, 23, 24 years old, waivers becomes a factor, and all of those things start to chip away at your reputation, and then suddenly you're just an AHL guy. So he needs to figure it out here, and I'm just not sure what that looks like for him anymore, because he doesn't seem to really fit the checker mold well. He doesn't really look like a bottom six guy, and he certainly hasn't played well enough to earn minutes in terms of offensive opportunities. So he's in a sticky situation for sure.
Scott, we talked about Chaz Lucius and getting a chance to speak with him. Well, I think probably the most heartwarming video of the 2021 NHL draft was Dmitry Kuzmin's video that they shot over in the KHL with his grandmother, and showing her excitement and what is Winnipeg and all that stuff. So, I mean, he seems to be a really great kid off the ice. What can Jets fans expect from the third rounder on the ice from the Belarusian?
Well, he's a project for sure. Anytime you travel such an unconventional path, which, let's be honest, coming up through Belarus and not going elsewhere until this year to play is a very different path that has seldom produced any kind of NHL talent. Obviously, last year there were two kids. The Canucks took another Belarusian. But in saying that, I think he's had a fine first year in North America here. I think hasn't looked out of place. He's actually defended better than I thought he would, and maybe his offense hasn't quite come like I thought it would. He obviously really wowed everybody at World Under-18s with his skill level and his ability to hang on to the puck and his ability to make plays off the point. And he's a really fun, slick, sort of puck carrying type. And I think increasingly you're going to see him do more of that in the OHL. He plays at a program that, frankly, hasn't surrounded him with a ton of talent as well. So that's a piece of it. And then you've got billets, and you've got the language barrier, and you've got a new country, and all of that enters into the equation as well. So I think he deserves a little bit of grace and time. He's certainly a long-term piece of the puzzle if you're sort of looking at an NHL future. But the talent is there. He can really skate. He's got great edges. He can handle the puck. He's confident in sort of on the attack. And then I've been really impressed by the way he's defended good players this year as well, which is a nice boost for him, and I'm sure a confidence builder for him. So I expect him to take a big step next year, and then you sort of go from there with him.
Scott Wheeler of The Athletic is our guest Saturday morning. You're watching the Illegal Curve Hockey Show. Scott, I sent, we were chatting by email before, and I said I was going to ask you about Nathan Smith, because anybody who is looking at your article, and we tweeted out a link to it from The Athletic, they would notice that Nathan Smith is not listed there because he's over 23 years old.
Yep.
And your criteria are that you have to be under 23. You know, earlier this week, Kevin Cheveldayoff met with the media here. He talked about Nathan Smith and about trying to get him under contract. We know he's playing overseas at the Olympics with Team USA right now. You know, most of the time, you know, you are what you are when you get to be a certain age. And Nathan Smith would certainly be a late bloomer as well. Do you see him as a bona fide NHLer, or, you know, what do you see his career trajectory when his college career comes to an end, be it after this year or be it after next year, whenever it might be?
Well, I think he'll follow the trajectory that you typically expect out of most sort of non-first rounders coming out of college, which is he might get a cup of coffee late in this season if they manage to sign him, play a few games, and then next year he's a training camp guy who competes for a job, but maybe starts in the AHL. And I think that's kind of the path that you expect. The teams typically like to get those guys into games right away just to see what they have, because they haven't played professionally and because they haven't been involved with the system in terms of development camps, prospect tournaments. The college guys never participate in those kinds of things. The teams typically want to kind of trial by fire, like drink out of a fire hose and let's see where you're at kind of situation. So I think if he does sign this year, that's what you should expect, is for him to get some games almost immediately. But that doesn't mean that he's going to be a full-time NHLer. And I still think he's the kind of prospect who's going to need some seasoning in the AHL. Certainly he's on the older side. I mean, you touched on it. He's 23 and he's a junior in college. He's in his third year in college despite being 23, which really does make him very old in terms of the context of college hockey players. So he was late to enter college, spent a few years in the USHL. It was kind of a circuitous route for him, but he's arrived now for sure. He's the second leading scorer, I believe, in college hockey at the moment behind Bobby Brink. And he's a legitimate piece. I don't think he's going to be a top six guy per se, but I think he's the kind of player you could serviceably use on a third line and kind of slide up and down the lineup and have him contributing in a variety of areas. He's just a good, effective hockey player. And every team needs those guys. Not every guy has to be the sort of dynamic star, right? So I think he's going to be a piece of the puzzle for them, and eventually a top 12 regular guy in the lineup who contributes offensively. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with him. It's not hard to imagine him on a second power play unit or anything like that either. So he's been kind of quiet, I must admit, through the first 2 games at the Olympics. He's of the sort of NHL prospects on that team, of which there are more than a dozen on that USA team. He's probably been one of the quieter players, but I wouldn't read too much into that. And he's still had a tremendous year in college, obviously, and looks like he's going to get signed and become an option.
Scott Wheeler covers the NHL draft and prospects nationally for The Athletic. Scott, appreciate your time. Appreciate your insight into some of
Dylan
these
Samberg question, Drew. I mean,
okay, sorry, go ahead as he asked one more question.
Get in there. I know, Scott, you got to move, but come on, I got to get my Dylan Samberg question.
The guy's got to get to the recycling center, for God's sake, Ezzy. The cardboard's not going to sort itself. Yeah.
Scott, do you know if Dylan Samberg is able to help you move today?
I can use his muscle.
Yeah. He was ranked 7th in your prospect pool rankings for the Jets. And I think some Jets fans might, maybe think that's kind of low, just I think because of the fact that we've been waiting so long. And he got into 6 games this year and looked really good, but again, suffers an injury. And he's just had the worst luck. Dave covers the Moose regularly, and he would tell you that, it's just really unfortunate that Samberg, just had to get, has to sit out again. But I guess in your evaluation, do you still see him having that upside of being a top 4 defenseman? In the article, you mentioned that you see him playing regularly at even strength and, on the penalty kill as well. I guess, that second part of the question is, what did you think in his 6th game with the Jets as well?
Yeah, it's funny. I released the ranking, and then he played those first couple of games back with the Jets and was excellent. And I immediately had questions because the gap in between when the ranking came out and when he played those games, and he had impressed in those games, I immediately had questions that said, would you have moved him up after seeing him play? And the answer was kind of maybe, yeah. Like he was kind of always in that 5 to 7 group for me. I wouldn't have him in the top 4 that we've already talked about, but he's right in that next group. And I think he's a legitimate guy. And the offense, I think, got skewed a little bit in college late, just because top prospects tend to get power play time in college hockey. They tend to put up points, even if they're not going to be power play guys or productive guys at the next level. And I think Dylan kind of fit into that category where you're never going to see him on a power play in the NHL, even though he was on one in college. So I don't think there's a ton of offense to his game per se, but he's huge. He can really skate. And if he can stay healthy at that size with his mobility and his ability to defend, and then also just competently move the puck, I don't want to say that he's not talented. He's definitely got some talent as well. He's going to be second pairing guy is kind of what you imagine for him. And if not, he'll be a darn good third pairing guy, I think. So that's kind of the mold that I envision him. I could see him playing 18, 19 minutes a night on an NHL team. And he may not be the 23, 24 top of the lineup guy, but I think he's going to be in that next group. And he can certainly defend at a high level. And the size helps and gives him a little bit of a different look than a lot of the players that are coming up, including Kuzmin and Heinola, who obviously look much different than Samberg does. So it's good to have that variety within their group.
Scott, I'm going to also sneak in here and get one last one.
You have too much knowledge to share with our audience, Scott. We need to get more and more out of you.
Anytime we can do prospect talk, I mean, a lot of the prospects, especially the ones on the Moose, we get a chance to cover, but the other ones, we don't have that fortune really. So, the last couple of years prior to this one, the Jets had gone in the second round. They'd gone with Swedes, and we were talking Daniel Torgersson, who obviously it was dealing with injury, and Simon Lundmark, who we've actually now had the opportunity to see. And he's really been a beneficiary of all these Jets call-ups, because Lundmark, I think, has really blossomed into a kind of almost like a Dylan DeMello, very solid type player. But the one I really want to ask you about was Torgersson, because of course he had to deal with the injury. So what does it look like for him, and what can Jets fans kind of expect from him?
Yeah, another guy who was like Samberg on a really promising path and then dealt with a pretty gruesome injury that set him back basically a year. And that's disappointing for sure. I've spoken to people with his club teams, plural, because he's played for 2 different teams this year over in Sweden. And they still like him. They still like him as a guy who can really shoot the puck, who can really skate, who's got size, who has filled out his frame. He really used, according to the staff over there, really used the time off to get stronger in the gym and to bulk up and to add some muscle. And he was already a strong kid before. So he's kind of in the the vision for him, if you will, over there is to turn him into kind of a second line SHL power forward scorer type, and then potentially a third line kind of piece in the NHL if he gets lucky. So I think now, because of the injury, the odds of that sort of coming to fruition look longer than they did in his draft year when he really lit it up in the Swedish junior ranks and looked like a legitimate offensive piece. But if he can become a complimentary sort of bottom six guy with that shot of his, who can also put the puck in the net every once in a while, that's still good value in where he was picked. So Torgerson's still interesting. He's still worth keeping an eye on, but the injury is definitely a talking point in terms of what comes next for him, and it's set him back for sure.
Scott Wheeler is with the Athletic. Scott, next time you're moving, we'll hook you up with our friends from Rolly's Transfer. They're one of our official sponsors, so they'll be able to take care of all that cardboard for you.
They'll move your piano, Scott.
And they will move your piano too, yes.
Next time I'm moving, I'll make sure I'm in front of a laptop for this rather than in my car as well.
That's okay. It worked out perfectly well. Scott, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Enjoy your time at the recycling center, and we appreciate your insight into these Jets prospects.
Thanks, guys.